I thought I was just taking a simple job to survive, but I walked straight into a nightmare I could never escape. 2 7-foot twin brothers, a silent house full of locked doors, and a mother who controlled everything with fear. What I discovered in the hidden basement changed everything I believed about truth and safety. When I finally reached out for help, the entire secret system collapsed, but not without destroying lives, trust, and my peace of mind. This is the story of how I survived something I was never meant to uncover. I remember the day Boss Cameron called me. He said, "I have a job for you, but it's strange." I replied, "I need work, anything is fine." He said, "2 giant brothers need help in a remote house." I didn't think too much. I just agreed. Zane grabbed my arm and said, "Don't go there, I feel something wrong." I laughed and said, "You worry too much, I need this job." When I reached the house, I saw them. One of them said, "You are late." The other just stared at me silently. I whispered, "Are you Rafik and Samir?" Rafik said, "Yes. Follow rules. No questions." Their mother looked at me like I was already guilty. I felt something inside me warn me. That night I asked Zane on phone, "What is wrong with this place?" Zane said, "People don't come back from there." I swallowed hard and said, "I already signed the contract." Outside my room I heard heavy footsteps. I whispered, "Who is there?" No answer came. I realized I was trapped in something bigger than me. I sat on the bed and called out softly, "Boss Cameron, I want to leave." No reply. Rafik's voice came from outside, "You cannot leave now." I opened the door slightly and said, "Why?" "I just work here." Samir stepped closer and said, "Rules are rules." Their size made me step back. I said, "I don't understand any of this." Their mother appeared behind them and said, "You will learn soon." I asked, "Learn what exactly?" She smiled coldly and said, "Patience." I went back to my room but I couldn't sleep. I called Zane again and said, "I think I made a mistake." "Zane, get out now." I whispered, "I can't. Something feels wrong here." Suddenly I heard footsteps again outside my room. A voice said, "Don't move." I froze and said, "Who are you?" No answer. I slowly opened the door. Rafik was standing there and said, "You should sleep." I said, "Why are you watching me?" Samir replied, "Because you are important now." I felt my heart beating fast and said, "Important for what?" They both stayed silent. Their mother's shadow appeared behind them again. She said softly, "He will understand soon." I stepped back and said, "I don't want any trouble." Rafik moved closer and said, "Too late for that." I whispered, "What do you want from me?" Samir said, "You will find out." I heard loud footsteps all around the house. I thought, I am not safe here. Then the lights went off. I whispered, "Hello?" but no one answered. I heard breathing behind me. I turned slowly and saw Rafik staring at me in the dark. I couldn't move and I realized I was trapped. In that moment I understood my life had already changed forever. Rafik whispered, "Welcome to the truth." I stood there in silence as fear took over me. I knew there was no turning back now. My nightmare had begun. I stayed in that house for days but nothing felt normal. I asked Rafik, "Why are there so many rules here?" He replied coldly, "Because this house is not like outside." Samir added, "You follow, you don't question." I said, "Even my phone is taken away. That's not normal." Their mother said, "Normal is dangerous here." I looked at her and asked, "What does that even mean?" She turned away and said, "You will understand soon enough." One evening I went outside and saw old man Aslam watching the house. I walked to him and asked, "Do you live nearby?" He whispered, "Boy, leave this place." I said, "Why does everyone say that?" He looked scared and said, "People who work here, they don't stay long." I asked, "Where do they go?" He shook his head and said, "No one knows." Then he walked away fast like he was afraid someone was watching him. Later Sarah came to visit me. She held my hand and said, "I don't like this place." I asked, "What did you see?" She said, "Nothing is right here. You should quit." I replied, "I can't. I tried calling Boss Cameron." She said, "And?" I said, "No answer. It's like he disappeared." Sarah looked worried and said, "Then you are trapped." I laughed a little and said, "Trapped? That sounds too serious." But even I didn't believe my own words. That night I saw something strange. Rafik and Samir were carrying heavy locked boxes. I followed them quietly and said, "What are those?" Rafik stopped and said, "Go back." I asked again, "I just want to know." Samir stared at me and said, "Not your concern." I said, Everything in this house feels secret. They didn't answer and walked away. I stood there alone and whispered, something is very wrong here. I went back inside and tried calling Boss Cameron again. I said, pick up, please. But the phone stayed dead. I told myself, maybe I'm just overthinking. But then I heard footsteps in the hallway. I turned and saw Rafik standing there. He said, you are not sleeping. I replied, I couldn't. He said, good. Night is not safe. I asked, not safe for what? He didn't answer. Samir came behind him and said, you ask too many questions. I said, because nothing makes sense here. Their mother appeared and said, sense is not needed here. I looked at her and said, then what is? She replied, obedience. I felt my chest tighten and said, I'm just here to work. Rafik stepped closer and said, work is not all you are here for. I stepped back and said, what does that mean? No one answered me. I went to my room but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the boxes, the locked doors and the missing workers. I whispered to myself, I should leave. But every time I tried, something stopped me. Outside my window I saw shadows moving. I asked, who is there? No answer came. Only silence. I realized something cold inside me. This house was not just strange, it was controlled. And I was already inside it. I waited until the house went quiet before I moved. I told myself, just see where they go, nothing more. I whispered to myself, stay calm, don't get caught. Then I saw Rafik and Samir walking down the hallway. I followed them slowly and said under my breath, where are you going this late? They didn't notice me. Or maybe they did and didn't care. Rafik said softly, make sure no one follows. Samir replied, no one ever does. I froze and whispered, I think they are going somewhere hidden. They stopped at a wall that looked normal. Rafik touched a spot and said, open. A hidden door clicked. I whispered, what is that? They went inside. I waited a few seconds and followed carefully. I said to myself, if I turn back now, I will never know the truth. I stepped in and saw stairs going down. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it. I whispered, this is not normal, this is not normal. At the bottom I saw a large room. I said quietly, what is this place? There were tables, locked drawers and stacks of documents. Money bundles were everywhere. Strange machines were running. I whispered, this looks like some kind of operation. I pulled one file closer and said, names? My hands started shaking. I read, missing persons list. I whispered, no way. Then I heard a voice behind me. Put that down. I turned fast and saw Dr. Naveed standing there. I said, who are you? He replied, someone trying to stop you from making a mistake. I said, what mistake? He stepped closer and said, you don't understand what you are walking into. I said, then explain. He shook his head and said, you are not supposed to be here. I whispered, these files, these are missing people. He said sharply, forget what you saw. I said, I can't just forget this. Suddenly I heard footsteps again. Rafik's voice came from behind me, I told you not to follow. I turned and said, I needed answers. Samir appeared and said, you got too close. I stepped back and said, I didn't mean to. Rafik grabbed my arm tightly. I said, let go. He looked at me with anger and said, you are not safe here now. I asked, safe from what? He didn't answer. I looked around and said, this place is illegal. I know it. Dr. Naveed said quietly, it is worse than illegal. I tried pulling away and said, I'm leaving. Rafik tightened his grip and said, no one leaves after seeing this. I felt my chest drop. I said, so I'm trapped now? Samir stepped closer and said, now you understand. I looked at the files again and whispered, what have I gotten into? Rafik finally released my arm but said, you are part of it now. I stepped back slowly and said, I never agreed to this. Dr. Naveed said, none of us did. I realized my hands were still shaking. I said softly, I'm not just a worker here anymore. Rafik looked at me and said, no, you are a secret now. I stood in silence, hearing the machines buzzing around me. And I finally understood I couldn't walk out the same way I came in. I called Boss Cameron again and said, why did you send me here? He laughed lightly and said, you finally noticed. I froze and said, what do you mean? He replied, you were always part of the plan. I said, plan? I came here for a job. He said, no, you came here because we needed someone like you. I shouted, you lied to me. He calmly said, "You were chosen, not lied to." I whispered, "Chosen for what?" But the call cut off. I stood there shaking and said, "This can't be real." Then I saw Sarah outside the gate. I ran to her and said, "Why are you here?" She said, "I came to take you away." I held her hand and said, "We need to leave now." She nodded and said, "I have a plan." We moved toward the back exit. I whispered, "Stay quiet, just follow me." Suddenly Rafik's voice came, "Stop." We froze. I said, "Run." Sarah tried to move but guards surrounded us. She shouted, "Let him go." Rafik stepped forward and said, "You should not have come here." I said, "She has nothing to do with this." Samir said coldly, "Everything here has something to do with everything." Sarah looked at me and said, "I told you this place is dangerous." I said, "I know. I'm sorry." Rafik looked at me and said, "You choose now." I asked, "Choose what?" He said, "You stay or she suffers." I shouted, "Don't involve her." Sarah screamed, "Just leave me and go." I shook my head and said, "I can't." Rafik stepped closer and said, "Then decide faster." I felt my chest burning and said, "This is not fair." Samir said, "Nothing here is fair." I looked at Sarah and whispered, "I'm sorry?" She cried and said, "Don't trust them." Before I could move, they dragged her away. I shouted, "Sarah?" Rafik stopped me and said, "One more step and you lose her forever." I froze and said, "What do you want from me?" He replied, "Obedience." I felt broken and said, "You are monsters." Samir said, "We are survivors." They took Sarah inside and locked the gate. I fell to my knees and said, "I can't do this anymore." Then I heard footsteps behind me. It was Zain. He said, "I finally found you." I stood up and said, "Zain, get out of here." He said, "I came to save you." I said, "You don't understand what's happening." He grabbed my shoulder and said, "I know more than you think." I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "This place, it's a system, not a house." I whispered, "So it's true." He nodded and said, "Many workers never leave." I said, "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" He replied, "I didn't know you were already inside it." I looked back at the locked gate and said, "Now I understand. I'm trapped." Zain said, "Not just trapped, controlled." I closed my eyes and said, "Everything I trusted is gone." And for the first time I felt I was inside something I could never escape. I couldn't stay silent anymore, so I secretly called Inspector Harris and said, "I need help." He replied, "Who is this?" I said, "Someone trapped in a dangerous house." He said, "Speak clearly." I whispered, "There are missing people, secret operations and controlled workers." He said, "Do you have proof?" I replied, "Not yet, but I will get it." He said, "Be careful. Don't get caught." I ended the call and said to myself, "This is the only way out." But the next morning everything changed. Rafik stood in front of me and said, "You made a mistake." I froze and said, "I don't know what you mean." He stepped closer and said, "You called someone." I tried to act calm and said, "No, I didn't." Samir walked in and said, "Lies don't work here." I said, "You are spying on me?" Rafik replied, "We have to." I shouted, "I just want freedom." Rafik suddenly grabbed my shoulder and said, "Freedom doesn't exist for us either." I paused and said, "What are you talking about?" For the first time his voice changed. He said, "We are also trapped." I looked at him and said, "You? You control everything here." He shook his head and said, "You don't understand who controls us." That confused me completely. I said, "Then who does?" He didn't answer. Samir looked away and said, "Some doors should stay closed." I whispered, "This is bigger than I thought." Then Mrs. Halima appeared behind them. She said, "Enough talking." I turned to her and said, "Tell me the truth." She smiled coldly and said, "Truth is not for everyone." I said, "I already know too much." She stepped closer and said, "No, you know nothing yet." Rafik looked at her and said, "Mother?" She raised her hand and said, "Silence." Then she turned to me and said, "Do you think they were born ordinary?" I said, "I don't understand." She replied, "They were born for a purpose." I stepped back and said, "What purpose?" She said, "A purpose tied to something far above this house." I asked, "What are you hiding?" She said, "An organization that built everything you see." I felt my chest tighten and said, "So the twins are part of it?" She nodded slowly and said, "They are only pieces." I looked at Rafiq and Samir and said, "Is this true?" Rafiq looked down and said nothing. That silence hurt more than words. I whispered, "So I was never safe here." Mrs. Halima said, "No one is safe who enters this system." I felt my hands shaking and said, "Then what am I supposed to do?" She replied, "Survive, if you can." I stepped back and said, "This is not just a house anymore." Rafiq finally looked at me and said, "Now you understand." I shook my head and said, "No. I understand something worse." I realized in that moment the twins were not my enemy. They were also trapped like me. And something much bigger was controlling all of us. I told myself, I will not run anymore. I called Inspector Harris and said, "I am ready to expose everything." He replied, "Only if you bring proof." I said, "I will get it." He warned me, "One mistake and you disappear too." I whispered, "I don't care anymore. This has to end." That night I went back near the basement. I said to myself, "Stay calm, just collect what you can." Sarah met me secretly and said, "You shouldn't be here." I replied, "I have to do this." She said, "They are watching everything." I said, "Then help me stay ahead of them." She nodded and said, "What do you need?" I said, "Files, recordings, anything that proves what is happening here." She whispered, "This is dangerous." I said, "Everything here is dangerous already." We moved quietly and I said, "If we get caught, don't speak." She replied, "I understand." Inside the storage room I started pulling files and said, "These names, they are all missing people." Sarah said, "Don't read too much or you will freeze." I said, "I need to know the truth." I recorded everything on my phone and said, "This is enough proof." Sarah said, "Hurry." Suddenly we heard footsteps. I whispered, "Someone is coming." We hid and I said softly, "Don't breathe." After they passed I said, "That was too close." Sarah said, "We can't do this again." I replied, "We won't need to." Outside Zane was waiting. He said, "I blocked the cameras for a few minutes." I said, "Good timing." He asked, "Did you get it?" I showed him the files and said, "Everything." He said, "Then we are closer than ever." I nodded and said, "But I feel like they already know." He said, "They always know, we just delay them." I looked at the house and said, "Something feels different today." Zane said, "Because they are shifting behavior." Inside I saw Rafiq and Samir standing silently. I said, "They look different." Sarah said, "I noticed it too." I whispered, "They don't look fully in control." Rafiq suddenly looked at me and said, "You are still here." I replied, "I never left." Samir said quietly, "We didn't choose this either." I froze and said, "What did you say?" Rafiq looked down and said, "It is not what you think." I said, "Then explain it." He shook his head and said, "We can't." I whispered, "So even you are trapped?" Sarah said, "This is getting worse." I replied, "No, this is getting clearer." I started connecting everything and said, "The system controls all of us." Zane said, "Then your revenge is not just against them." I nodded and said, "It is against whoever built this." Sarah asked, "What now?" I said, "We prepare for the final step." Zane said, "You mean confrontation?" I replied, "Yes, everything ends there." I looked at the files again and said, "They made a mistake letting me see this." Sarah said softly, "Or maybe this was planned." I paused and said, "If it was, then I am already inside their game." Zane placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "Then we change the game." I nodded and said, "No more running." From that moment, I knew everything was moving toward one final confrontation I could not avoid. I still remember the night everything ended. I stood outside the house and whispered, "It's happening." Zane looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" I replied, "I don't think anyone is ever ready for this." Sarah held my hand and said, "Don't look back." I nodded and said, "I won't." Then I heard sirens. Inspector Harris arrived and shouted, "Move! Everyone in position." I said, "This is it." He looked at me and said, "Stay behind us." I replied, "I need to see this." They stormed the house. I heard Harris shout, "Secure the rooms." Another officer said, "Basement is clear." I whispered, "It's really happening?" Rafiq and Samir stood in the center of the hall. I stepped forward and said, "Why aren't you running?" Rafiq said quietly, "Running changes nothing." Samir added, "It never did." I said, "You could still escape." Rafiq shook his head and said, "Escape from what we are?" Mrs. Halima rushed in shouting, "Stop them! Destroy everything!" I yelled, "She's destroying evidence." Officers moved in fast. I heard Horace say, "She's under arrest." She screamed, "You don't understand what you are breaking." I said, "No. I finally understand." Papers flew everywhere. Computers were seized. I whispered, "The truth is coming out." Horace turned to me and said, "We found everything you sent." I replied, "Then it worked." He said, "This network is bigger than we thought." I said, "But it's falling now." Suddenly I saw Boss Cameron being dragged out. I stepped forward and said, "You lied to me." He looked down and said, "I had no choice." I shouted, "You destroyed my life." He didn't answer. Then I saw Dr. Naveed trying to escape from the back. An officer shouted, "Stop him." I whispered, "So it's all connected." Everything was collapsing fast. Horace said, "Network is down. All records secured." I asked, "What about the twins?" An officer replied, "Detaining them now." I looked and saw Rafiq and Samir being taken away. I walked closer and said, "Was any of it real?" Rafiq looked at me and said softly, "More real than you think." Samir added, "We never wanted this." I said, "Then why didn't you stop it?" They stayed silent. For the first time I saw something different in their eyes, relief. Sarah came beside me and said, "It's over." I replied, "I don't feel like it is." Zain smiled and said, "It is. Finally." I looked at everything happening and whispered, "So this is freedom?" But I felt nothing like victory. Sarah held my hand tighter and said, "You did it." I replied, "I just survived it." Zain said, "That's enough." I looked at the broken house and said, "All of this, for the truth." Horace walked over and said, "You helped bring down something huge." I nodded and said, "But it took everything from me." Sarah said softly, "But you're alive." I looked at the sky and whispered, "Yeah, I am." The trucks drove away with evidence, arrests, and secrets exposed. I stood there with empty silence around me. I said quietly, "It's finally free." But inside, I knew I would never feel the same again.